Look at this. Walls stretching 50 feet into the sky. Stone so tightly fitted you can barely slide a knife between the blocks. Built without cranes, without power tools, without blueprints drawn on a computer. Thousands of men, decades of work. And the result? A structure so robust that some of them are still standing, almost 1,000 years later. But here is what nobody ever tells you. Building a medieval castle wasn't just a construction project. It was a military strategy, a political statement, and an engineering marvel, all at the same time. In the next 12 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how these structures went from a patch of empty ground to one of the most formidable fortifications ever built by human hands. Before we talk about how they were built, we need to understand why they were built, because the purpose shaped every single design decision. In early medieval Europe, power wasn't held by a central government. It was fragmented across hundreds of lords, earls and barons, each one controlling a piece of land and desperately trying to keep it. Conflict was constant. Raids, invasions, civil wars. Violence was practically the background noise of their era. A lord needed somewhere to fall back to when things went wrong. Somewhere his enemies couldn't easily take. And just as importantly, he needed a symbol. Something visible for miles in every direction that said, "This land belongs to me, and taking it will cost you everything." The castle was the answer to both of those problems at once. Early versions were crude, basically a wooden tower on top of an earthen mound, surrounded by a fence. These were called Motter and Bailey castles, and a skilled crew could throw one together in a matter of weeks. They were fast, cheap, and effective enough for the time. But wood rots, wood burns, and as sieges became more sophisticated, lords who wanted to hold their power started reaching for something more permanent. They started building in stone. The first major decision wasn't about walls or towers. It was about the ground beneath them. Location was everything. A badly placed castle was worse than no castle at all. You'd pour years of labour and a fortune in resources into something your enemy could easily surround and ignore. The ideal site had natural advantages built right in. A hilltop offered visibility and made attackers climb uphill under fire. A river bend put water on three sides, turning the landscape itself into a moat. A narrow coastal cliff removed the threat of a ground assault from multiple directions entirely. Lords and their advisors, military men, surveyors, experienced builders, would walk the land carefully before committing. They were thinking about, where does the water drain? Where can a siege tower approach? Where does the ground become unstable when it rains? The bedrock mattered enormously. A heavy stone castle required soil that could bear enormous weight without shifting. Building it on poor ground wasn't just structurally dangerous, it was a slow disaster. Walls would crack, towers would lean, and the whole investment would crumble within a generation. Once the site was chosen, the real work began. Here's something that often gets lost in the history books. Castles weren't built by nameless masses. They were built by skilled professionals who travelled from project to project across the continent. At the top of the hierarchy was the master mason. Think of him as the architect and project manager rolled into one. He designed the structure, supervised the work, solved problems as they appeared, and answered directly to the lord who was paying for everything. A master mason with a strong reputation could command extraordinary wages, sometimes 10 times what a labourer earned. Below him came the journeyman masons. Men who had completed years of apprenticeship and could cut, shape and lay stone to precise specifications. Alongside them worked carpenters, blacksmiths, mortar mixers and scaffolding crews. Then there were the labourers, hundreds, sometimes thousands of them, depending on the project's scale, digging foundations, hauling stone, carrying water, turning the massive wheels of cranes. Many were local peasants, some working voluntarily for wages, others fulfilling feudal obligations to their lord. Managing all of this was a logistical challenge that rivaled the construction itself. Workers needed food, shelter, tools, and pay. Records from major English castle projects in the 13th century show royal clerks tracking every penny spent, from the master mason's salary to the cost of candles for working after dark. This wasn't improvised. It was organised on a scale most people don't associate with the medieval world. The single biggest challenge in building a stone castle wasn't the design, it wasn't even the labour. It was getting the stone there in the first place. Quarrying operations were set up nearby whenever possible. Teams would identify suitable rock. Limestone and sandstone were common choices, tough enough to resist assault but workable enough to cut with hand tools. Miners would chip and wedge enormous blocks free from the earth, often splitting them along natural fault lines by driving wooden pegs into cracks, soaking the wood with water and letting the expansion do the work. Moving those blocks to the building site was where things got genuinely difficult. A single large cut stone could weigh 2 tons or more. Over flat ground, it might be loaded onto a wooden sledge and dragged by teams of oxen. Near water, it was almost always transported by boat, far cheaper and faster than overland hauling. Entire canal systems were sometimes dug specifically to serve a major construction project. The mortar that held it all together was made from lime, sand, and water. Limestone was burned in massive kilns to produce quicklime, which was then mixed on site. Getting the proportions right mattered enormously. Too weak and the joints would crumble, too brittle and they'd crack under stress. Timber was required in staggering quantities as well. For scaffolding, for roof structures, for floors, for the massive formwork that supported arched openings while the mortar cured. A large castle project might consume entire forests worth of wood before a single permanent roof was laid. With materials arriving and workers in place, construction began from the ground up, literally. Foundations, trenches were dug down to stable bedrock, sometimes 20 feet or more. The foundation had to distribute the weight of walls that might eventually stand 60 feet tall and 10 feet thick. In soft ground, workers would drive wooden piles deep into the earth to create a more stable base, a technique that would have looked at home on a modern building site. The walls. Medieval castle walls weren't solid stone all the way through. That would have been prohibitively expensive. Instead, they were built as 2 outer faces of cut stone, with the space in between packed with rubble and poured with mortar. This gave the walls their enormous thickness and strength, while keeping material costs manageable. As the walls rose, wooden scaffolding went up alongside them. Workers stood on platforms called potlogs, slotting wooden beams directly into holes left in the wall as it was built. You can still see those holes in surviving medieval stonework today. Towers and gates towers weren't decorative. They were carefully positioned to allow defenders to fire along the outer face of the walls, eliminating the blind spots that attackers loved to hide in. The gatehouse was typically the most heavily fortified single element of the entire castle, layered with portcullises, drawbridges, arrow loops, and murder holes. Openings in the ceiling where defenders could drop stones or boiling liquid onto anyone who made it inside. Interior buildings. Inside the defensive perimeter, a functioning world took shape. Great halls for eating and gathering, chapels for worship, kitchens, stables, barracks, storage rooms and wells. The Lord's private quarters, the solar, positioned to catch the most light and furthest from potential breach points. The best designed castles could sustain a population of hundreds through a prolonged siege without outside resupply. Here's a number that puts everything in perspective. Edward I of England spent roughly £80,000 building his network of castles in Wales between 1277 and 1304. That's the equivalent of the entire royal treasury for several years. And he was one of the wealthiest monarchs in Europe. Large-scale stone castles typically took between 10 and 30 years to complete. And that's under favourable conditions, with consistent funding and an uninterrupted labour supply. Many projects stretched far longer. Wars, famines, revolts, and simply running out of money could pause construction for years at a time. Some castles were never finished at all. You can still find abandoned projects across Europe, half-built towers standing in empty fields, the ambition of some long-forgotten lord outlasting his wealth by centuries. The ones that were completed, though, they represented something extraordinary, a sustained act of collective will, maintained across decades, often across multiple human lifetimes, in service of a single vision. Medieval castles were eventually made obsolete. Gunpowder changed everything. Walls that could shrug off a battering ram crumbled under sustained cannon fire. By the 16th century, the age of the castle as a serious military fortification was largely over. But here's what's remarkable. After 5 centuries of wars, neglect, and deliberate demolition, hundreds of them are still standing. Not because anyone maintained them, because they were built so well that even abandonment couldn't fully destroy them. There's no project management software behind those walls, no computer-aided design, no concrete, no rebar, no prefabricated components, just stone, lime, wood, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of craftsmen, passed from master to apprentice, refined with every project, applied with extraordinary care. The next time you see a photograph of a ruined castle or walk through one on a trip to Europe, I'd encourage you to look at the stonework. Run your hand along a wall if you're allowed to. What you're touching was cut and placed by a person who lived 1,000 years ago. A person who almost certainly never imagined that their work would still be standing when we got here. That's the legacy of medieval castle building. Not just in history books, not just in tourist attractions, in the stones themselves. The ones that were completed, though. They represented something extraordinary, a sustained act of collective will, maintained across decades, often across multiple human lifetimes, in service of a single vision.